Picture a courtroom, but, you know, not the kind with polished wood paneling and a judge sitting high up in a black robe.
Right, no gallery of reporters taking notes either.
Exactly. This is a courtroom constructed entirely from the rubble of a completely collapsed society. The smoke is literally still clearing.
The whole architecture of their civilization has just utterly failed.
Yeah.
Their economy, their justice system, the social contracts, it's all gone.
Imagine standing in the ashes of the institutions you trusted. The currency is worthless, the laws mean nothing, and the hierarchy is completely disintegrated.
And right there, standing in the ruins of everything they built, the people responsible are finally forced to look at the catastrophic consequences of their actions.
Yeah, there is no judge to mediate, no jury to hand down a verdict. There are just the wrongdoers staring at each other. And instantly the finger-pointing begins.
I mean, is the ultimate moment of reckoning. The masks are off, all those fancy titles and power dynamics have just shattered. And all that remains is this raw, desperate need to assign blame to someone else. The people who spent their lives following orders are pointing furiously at the powerful elites who gave those orders.
And the elites, the ones who controlled the wealth and the megaphones, they're pointing right back at the masses.
Exactly.
Now, this isn't a scene from a dystopian sci-fi novel. This is a 1,400-year-old courtroom scene, as decoded by a man who looked at ancient texts and saw the precise blueprints of modern societal collapse.
It's just a fascinating autopsy of a failed society.
Today, in this deep dive, we are pulling this from a highly influential lecture delivered in 1980 by the philosopher and scholar Allama Parvez.
Yeah, and he was analyzing a very specific 3-verse passage, verses 31 through 33 from a chapter of the Quran known as Surah Saba.
And, the historical context of when Parvez delivered this lecture is really crucial for understanding the sheer weight of what he's arguing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, 1980 was an incredibly volatile era. The Cold War was fundamentally reshaping global alliances. Authoritarian regimes were solidifying their grip.
And there was this massive surge in religious orthodoxy being used as a political tool to silence dissent.
Right. And in that environment, Parvez stood up and really challenged the traditional, comfortable interpretations of religious texts. Historically, many scholars read this specific passage as a purely theological description of the afterlife.
So they painted a picture in a literal fiery hell where sinners are just arguing with each other after they die.
A very classical Dante's Inferno scenario. Demons, brimstone, eternal physical torture, all of that.
But Parvez takes a radically different approach here.
He really does. He applies this purely rational socioeconomic lens to the text. He argues that the hell being described in this chaotic courtroom scene isn't just some distant metaphysical afterlife waiting beyond the grave.
Right. He defines it as a societal state here in this world, which is a massive paradigm shift.
It completely changes everything.
I mean, you're taking a concept that billions of people view as a post-mortem punishment and dragging it directly into the present tense. Parvez is basically suggesting that hell isn't a destination you're sent to, it's a condition you actively construct.
Yeah, and he bases this on a specific concept he calls sharaf-e-insaniyat, which roughly translates to the innate dignity of humanity or human nobility.
So for Parvez, every human being is born with an inherent, unalienable dignity.
Yes. Hell, therefore, is the condition of any society where that dignity is structurally stripped away.
So it's an exploitative ecosystem.
Exactly, divided entirely into masters and slaves, the powerful and the weak, the ideological elites and their blind followers.
Any system where one human being is subjugated by another, where a person is forced to bow to someone else's will.
Where they lose their rational autonomy and surrender their innate respect, yeah. That is the literal functional definition of hell on earth.
So when a system fails, like when a multinational company collapses due to corruption, or a political structure rots from the inside out and human dignity is lost, who is actually responsible?
That's the core question. We're looking at the exact moment the blame finally surfaces in the open.
We're going to examine the arguments from both sides of this divide, the manipulators and the manipulated, because this ancient text forces us to ask some deeply uncomfortable questions about power, complicity, and, the chains we might not even realize we're wearing.
It dismantles every comfortable excuse humanity has ever invented for why things go wrong.
Let's get right into it. To understand the mechanics of this societal collapse, we have to look at the first strike in this courtroom argument.
Right. The masses, the disempowered followers, they look at the arrogant elite, and they say the thing that seems most obvious to anyone who has ever felt crushed by a system.
They say, if it weren't for you, we would have been on the right path. You forced us into this ruin.
It's the classic defense of the underdog.
We were just the little guys. You had the wealth, you wrote the laws, you controlled the military, you owned the media. You ruined us.
And frankly, when you look at how power is concentrated in any society throughout history, that feels like a completely valid, airtight accusation.
Yeah, the people at the bottom of the pyramid are bearing the weight, so the people at the top must be the ones pushing down.
But the elites, the group Parwez refers to as the mustakbirin, meaning the arrogant ones, the ones who extract greatness for themselves at the expense of others, they fire back.
And it's a defense that just stops you right in your tracks.
They look at the masses and say, did we block you? Did we physically force you off the path after the truth, after the guidance came to you?
Did we block you? I mean, hold on. That sounds exactly like a convenient loophole for the powerful.
It's deliberately unsettling.
It's the classic, we just opened the door, you chose to walk through it, defense. If I open a casino, rig the games, and pump oxygen into the room so people stay awake for 3 days straight, I can't just blame the addicts for walking through the doors and gambling away their life savings.
That's a great analogy.
Saying, did we physically force you? Feels like the ultimate form of victim blaming. It just completely ignores the massive asymmetry of power.
Yeah.
A peasant and a king do not have equal agency.
No, the asymmetry of power is real, and Parwez does not deny the cruelty of the mustakbirin at all. We'll explore their severe punishment later.
Right.
But the text absolutely refuses to let the masses off the hook just because they were the weaker party. Parwez argues that a human being cannot be completely subjugated by another unless their own internal sense of worth, their own rational intellect, is fundamentally weak.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Well, he uses a really striking analogy drawn from the animal kingdom. Consider how animals establish dominance. A dog might fight another dog for territory or food, right? One dog might lose, submit, and roll over to show its belly in a scuffle to avoid being killed. But that dog does not go back to its den and build a shrine to the winning dog.
Oh, I see.
It doesn't structurally surrender its essence, its dogness, to the victor. It simply yields to physical force in the moment.
So it's a yielding of circumstance, not a yielding of the soul.
Precisely. But humans, we possess this unique psychological capacity to surrender our agency voluntarily. We have the ability to turn other flesh and blood humans into masters, into literal deities.
So Parwez is stressing that the mustakbirin, these elites, they don't possess magical powers.
Not at all. They are made of the exact same biological clay as the people they rule. Their power, their perceived invincibility, is almost entirely derived from the submission of the masses.
There's this great metaphor Parwez uses, drawing from the philosopher poet Muhammad Iqbal, about the elites being like snowmen or idols made of ice.
Yes. Iqbal was a massive intellectual influence on Parwez, and the imagery is profound. He suggests that these tyrants, these untouchable elites, are like giant idols carved out of lace.
So they only look terrifying and permanent in the cold.
Right. They look godlike in the dark, in the freezing cold of your own ignorance and fear. But the moment the sun of awareness rises, or the moment the masses simply choose to stand up from their prostration and generate the heat of resistance, the ice melts.
The power just vanishes into a puddle.
Exactly. So the elites in this courtroom argument are essentially saying, we didn't have the physical strength to put a chain on the neck of every single one of you. There were millions of you, and only a handful of us. You forged the chains, you handed them to us, and you put them on yourselves.
The implication being that the masses suffered from a failure of conviction.
Yes. The text uses the concept of iman, which Parwez defines not as blind faith, but as a rational, unshakable conviction in an objective higher truth.
Though the elites are basically arguing that the masses' iman was so fragile, so easily bought, that they willingly handed over their agency.
And Parwez is pointing out that the elites aren't entirely wrong in that specific assessment. The presence of tyrannical pressure, no matter how severe, does not retroactively erase the individual's foundational agency.
The guidance, the rational path, was available to both groups.
It was. The elites chose to obscure that path because it threatened their hoarding of power and wealth. But the masses chose to ignore that path because following it required courage, friction, and the discomfort of taking responsibility.
So the refusal of the masses to bear the weight of their own autonomy is the core rot that allows a society to fail.
That's the argument.
I mean, I understand the philosophical argument about agency, but I still struggle with the practical mechanics of it.
Mhm.
We all have free will, but we also live in environments designed to bypass that free will.
Right, you don't live in a vacuum.
Exactly. If the masses possessed agency, how was it stolen from them so effectively that they didn't even realize it was happening? Nobody just wakes up one Tuesday and says, I think I'll abandon my human dignity and become a willing cog in an exploitative machine today.
No, there has to be a process.
And this leads us directly into the masses' rebuttal in the courtroom. This is where the ancient text suddenly feels like a critique of the modern digital age.
Oh, absolutely. The masses do not just take the elite's defense lying down. When the elites sneer, "Did we block you?" the weak come back swinging.
What do they say?
Their reply is vital, they say. It was your relentless scheming night and day that turned us away.
The masses are arguing that they didn't just casually stroll into a trap of their own volition.
Right. They were pushed, nudged, confused, and blinded by a continuous 24/7 psychological operation.
It's psychological operation. That is the perfect term for what Parwes is describing here.
Let's dig deep into the specifics of this source material. How does this scheming night and day actually function? What are the actual levers being pulled to manufacture this consent?
Well, Parwes breaks this down into highly specific tactics utilized by the elite. He identifies two distinct branches of this elite class.
First, the political and economic rulers, and second, what he calls the Mazhabi Peshwai, which refers to the religious, ideological, or cultural leadership.
The narrative makers.
Exactly. Their first and most crucial tactic is the intentional obscuring of a concept called mukafat amal.
The law of cause and effect. The idea that actions have inevitable natural consequences.
Yes. A rationally healthy society operates on the understanding of mukafat amal. If you plant thorns, you don't harvest grapes. If you build an economy on exploitation, it will eventually collapse.
Simple logic.
But the elites intentionally blur this line of cause and effect. They run massive, continuous campaigns to convince the public that you can have deeply corrupt systems, rampant injustice and inequality, and somehow through magic, luck, or divine favoritism, it won't lead to ruin.
Wow. And to keep the masses from noticing the structural decay, the elites feed the public what Parwes translates as cheap popularity.
Yes. They use their immense resources to figure out what the masses blindly, basely desire, what entertains them, what distracts them, what pacifies their immediate anxieties, and they simply flood the zone with it.
It's basically the Roman concept of bread and circuses, but weaponized to a much higher degree.
Completely weaponized.
And the source mentions a specific tactic here that Parwes is fiercely critical of, the use of religious and ideological opiates. He explicitly discusses how the Mazhabi Peshwai, these religious elites, promote mindless rituals to keep the population docile.
Yeah, the phrase he focuses on is the promotion of isolated morning incantations or mindless chanting. Now, it's vital to understand that Parwes is not attacking spirituality or personal reflection here.
Right, he's attacking the weaponization of spirituality as a tool of state control.
Exactly. The ideological elites tell the impoverished, exhausted masses, don't worry about the failing economy. Don't protest against the corrupt rulers. Just sit in your designated corner, chant these specific mantras thousands of times, focus entirely on the afterlife, and leave the complex running of the physical world to us.
So they engineer a state of religious intoxication.
Yes, Parwes actually compares this state to feeding the population bang, a traditional intoxicating drink made from cannabis.
But, how exactly does a chant stop a revolution? What is the actual mechanism there? I mean, if I'm starving, chanting doesn't put food in my stomach, so why would the masses accept this?
The mechanism is deeply psychological, and we actually see it validated by modern neuroscience.
Oh, really?
Yeah. When you engage in endless, repetitive, mindless chanting without reflecting on the meaning of the words, you alter your cognitive load. You suppress the critical thinking centers of the brain.
So it's a physiological effect.
Totally. The elites are providing a synthetic sense of accomplishment. The individual feels they've done something righteous, something holy, simply by repeating a phrase for hours. They experience a chemical release, a sense of peace.
But it's an artificial peace that isolates them.
Notice that these practices often emphasize individual salvation over collective justice. If everyone is sitting alone in a room, intoxicated by the rhythm of a chant, they aren't organizing.
Right. They aren't questioning the supply chain. They aren't looking at the throne.
The elites essentially hijacked the human brain's desire for flow states and used it to prevent collective bargaining.
So the masses are basically complaining about cognitive exhaustion. It was your scheming night and day. When you look at how information flows today, that phrase takes on a chilling new resonance.
It really does.
Think about algorithmic social media feeds. Think about the 24-hour news cycle. It is the exact same machinery of the Mazabi Peswai, just upgraded with silicon and fiber optics.
The parallels are undeniable. The algorithm is the ultimate tool for discerning what you blindly desire.
Yes.
It calculates what triggers your outrage, what provides you with hollow validation, and what entertains you enough to keep your eyes on the screen. And then it just feeds you an endless, frictionless supply of it.
It normalizes injustice through sheer volume and proximity. I mean, you're just scrolling through a timeline, and your brain is forced to process a video of a catastrophic climate event, immediately followed by a celebrity gossip update, immediately followed by an advertisement for a new brand of toothbrush.
It's totally destabilizing.
Your brain cannot assign proper emotional weight to a tragedy when it's sandwiched between consumerism and entertainment. The cognitive dissonance is exhausting.
Exactly.
The scheming night and day isn't necessarily a secret cabal of men in a smoke-filled room rubbing their hands together. It's an environment. It is a digital architecture that exhausts your critical thinking until your baseline state is just apathy.
Yeah, the masses in this passage are essentially saying you bombarded us with so much noise, so many conflicting narratives, so much cheap popularity that we lost the capacity to identify the truth.
They were conditioned to set up rivals to objective reality. Society isn't captured by one grand cinematic decree from a dictator. It's captured by endless, exhausting microdoses of conditioning until the population just surrenders.
And that surrender is the ultimate goal, because once the conditioning takes hold, the critical faculties atrophy.
Right.
To ensure the masses never recover those faculties, the Mazabi Peshwai deploy another potent tactic that Parwez highlights. They lock the population in the past.
Oh, this is an interesting point.
They promote a fierce, unquestioning traditionalism. They tell the masses, the only safe path is to do exactly what your ancestors did. Don't look to the future. Don't attempt to innovate. Don't question if the ancient methods are actually solving modern problems.
That's insidious.
Parwez uses a powerful metaphor here. He says these ideological leaders actively hunt down and extinguish the lamps of intellect. Whenever a spark of rational thought, scientific inquiry, or social questioning appears in the society, the elites blow it out under the guise of protecting tradition.
So they're demanding blind adherence to the past. It's a paralyzing combination. The political and economic elites distract you with cheap popularity and systemic exhaustion, while the ideological elites paralyze you with forced traditionalism and false piety.
You're trapped between the circuses of the present and the dogma of the past.
Leaving no room to build a better future.
Exactly. Which brings us to the inevitable consequence of this toxic symbiosis. The elites scheme, the masses surrender their intellect, and the society begins to collapse under the weight of its own stagnation.
But how does the ancient text visualize the final result of this dynamic? What happens to the people who accept this arrangement?
Well, this leads us to the final and frankly most haunting image of the passage.
Right, the courtroom argument has been laid out. The weak have blamed the strong for the 24/7 psychological manipulation, and the strong have blamed the weak for lacking the conviction to resist.
And then the text provides a physical metaphor for the consequence of their actions. It states that collars, or chains, are placed on the necks of those who denied the rational system.
The chains. In a traditional literalist reading of the text, this is the moment where the imagery of physical torture is usually emphasized, right?
Usually, yes. You might picture fiery iron chains being dropped from the sky by angels, shackling the sinners as a divine punishment inflicted from above.
But remember Parwez's rational socioeconomic lens. He reads these chains not as a punitive measure enforced by an external warden, but as the self-imposed bondage of accepted exploitation.
The punishment isn't an alien object introduced to their lives. The punishment is simply the natural, hardened shape of the life they freely chose.
Think about the physical posture of a person who spends their entire life bowing to other human beings, silencing their own conscience, and accepting a system that degrades their innate human dignity.
If you continuously bend your neck to the mistakbirin, your spirit essentially calcifies into the shape of a slave.
The chains are the physical, unavoidable manifestation of the masses' own surrendered agency. Subjugation isn't a shirt that's forcibly put on you. It's a condition a people eventually consent to wear.
To really drive this concept home, we need to examine how Parwez defines hell itself in the source material. We touched on it earlier, but he spends a significant amount of time in his notes tracing the etymology of the word used in the Quran. Jahannam.
And the historical context he unearths here completely shattered my understanding of the concept.
Yeah, the etymological journey of the word Jahannam is a masterclass in how societal trauma becomes embedded in language. Parvez points out that the Arabic word Jahannam originates from the Hebrew term Gehenna,
Right.
and Gehenna, in turn, refers to a very real geographical location, the Valley of Hinnom, situated just south of ancient Jerusalem.
And what happened there?
Long before the advent of Islam, and even before the establishment of mainstream Judaism as we know it today, this valley was a site of horrific practices. Ancient Canaanites and some Israelites performed literal human sacrifices there. Specifically, they sacrificed children to a deity named Moloch.
Man, let's linger on that for a moment, because the psychological weight of that history is immense. We're talking about a society that convinced parents to take their own children to a valley and burn them alive to appease a perceived authority.
And Parvez connects the name of that ancient idol, Moloch, to the Arabic word Malik, which means king or master.
Oh, wow.
In the Quranic narrative, the warden or keeper of hell is specifically named Malik. Parvez draws a direct, brilliant line between these concepts. He asks his audience to look at what was fundamentally happening in the Valley of Hinnom.
Human beings, the most vulnerable among them, were being slaughtered.
Their potential, their humanity, was being violently destroyed and offered as a burnt sacrifice to an idol representing absolute tyrannical power Moloch, the master. Parvez argues that this historical atrocity is the true, functional definition of hell.
So any society where human dignity is slaughtered, where people are reduced to disposable ashes to feed the ego, the power, or the wealth of a master, a Malik, is currently existing as a Jahannam. The parallel to modern socioeconomic systems is devastating. I mean, when a corporate monopoly treats its workers in overseas factories like disposable cogs, grinding their physical and mental health to dust just to hit a quarterly profit target for the shareholders.
That's not just bad business.
Right. According to this framework, that is the modern equivalent of offering sacrifices to Moloch. When a political regime treats its citizens like mere statistics, drafting them into endless wars or crushing them under austerity measures to maintain the power of the ruling class, that society has transformed into the Valley of Hinnom.
It is currently in a state of hell.
It's wild to think about it that way.
The fire being described isn't literal flames licking your skin in the afterlife. Parvez quotes another part of the Quran describing a fire that leaps up over the hearts. It is the internal, agonizing psychological torment of knowing that you have been degraded.
That your essential human worth has been violated.
And that you allowed it to happen. And this is exactly why the systemic punishment for the elites, the mustakbirin who initiate this degradation, is so absolute. Parvez brings in a historical anecdote regarding the second caliph of Islam, Umar, to illustrate this.
Oh, this is a brilliant historical anecdote. Let's walk through what happened with Umar's governor.
So the story goes that a governor under Umar's rule, a man who possessed significant authority, once lost his temper at a civilian. And crucially, this civilian was a non-Muslim dhimmi, someone living under the state's covenant of protection.
Okay.
During this moment of anger, the governor used the Arabic word kizi toward the man. Kizi roughly translates to, may God humiliate you, or may you be disgraced.
Notice the specifics here. The governor didn't strike the man. He didn't confiscate the man's property. He didn't throw him in the prison.
No, none of that.
He just verbally attacked his dignity.
Just one word attacking the man's sharaf insaniyat, his human nobility. But when the governor's temper cooled and he realized the gravity of what he had uttered, he was utterly terrified. He didn't wait to be reprimanded. He traveled all the way to Medina to face Umar and immediately submitted his resignation.
And Umar, who is famously strict in his application of justice, accepted the resignation without a second thought.
Right. The governor in question was known to be a highly competent administrator and an honest man in terms of finances, but Umar's standard was uncompromising.
Anyone who casually attacks the fundamental dignity of another human being, regardless of the victim's faith or social status, is fundamentally unfit to hold power over others.
Because to strip someone of their dignity, even with a single word, is to strike the match that initiates the fires of hell in a society.
That philosophy is the polar opposite of what Parvez calls Mulukiyat. Mulukiyat translates to kingship, or the institutionalized master-slave dynamic.
Yes. The source material references the story of the Queen of Sheba from Surah to reinforce this point. The queen wisely observes that when the forces of Mulukiyat enter a functioning society, they inherently corrupt it.
They turn the social order upside down.
And their primary mechanism of control is to humiliate the most honorable, dignified people within that society. It's not necessarily a critique of a specific governmental structure, whether it calls itself a democracy, a dictatorship, or a monarchy.
It's a critique of the underlying dynamic. Does the system uphold and defend human dignity, or does it demand submission to a master?
And if you accept that demand for submission, you're accepting the chains of Jahannam.
To fully illustrate the ultimate spiritual tragedy of this accepted subjugation, Parwez once again leans on the poetry of Muhammad Iqbal.
And the concept Iqbal introduces here is striking. It borders on the terrifying, honestly. He writes about the personified concept of death itself confronting the Almighty.
The poetry of the dead. This section of Parwez's notes is incredibly poetic, but the underlying message is absolutely brutal. Let's break down Iqbal's imagery.
In Iqbal's poetic imagination, the angel of death goes to God and registers a complaint.
What does death say?
Death says, "I am deeply ashamed to take the soul of a subjugated person. My purpose is to end life, to sever the tether between the soul and the physical world. But a person who has surrendered their human dignity, a person who lived their entire existence as a willing slave, bowing to other men, was never truly alive to begin with."
Wow. Taking their soul feels like an insult to my function. It's like killing a corpse.
Yes, killing a corpse.
The idea that you can be biologically breathing, eating, and walking around, but spiritually and fundamentally dead because you lack the autonomy that defines a human being.
It gets darker. Iqbal then shifts the perspective to the grave itself. The grave receives the body of the subjugated person and immediately cries out in agony.
The grave.
The grave says, "I didn't know why my earth was suddenly burning and suffocating. Now I realize it's because you placed the corpse of a willing slave inside me. The very earth burns in shame from holding the dead weight of someone who accepted the chains of exploitation without a fight."
Man, this completely flips the traditional narrative of hell. Parwez channeling Iqbal is describing a hell that is actually fundamentally cold.
Yes. In another of Iqbal's works, he imagines taking a tour of hell and finding the entire landscape freezing and desolate. He turns to the warden of hell and asks, "Where's the roaring fire I was promised? Where is the brimstone?"
And the warden replies, "Hell has no fire of its own. People bring their own embers from the world."
People bring their own embers. That is the core of Parwez's thesis. The chains are not an external torture device. They are the physical manifestation of the mass's own surrendered agency.
The fire of hell is the accumulated shame, the suppressed guilt, the cognitive dissonance, and the lost dignity that you carry within your own psychology when you willingly participate in an unjust system. You generate the heat through your own degradation.
The system doesn't punish you. The system is the punishment. The stagnation of your intellect is the punishment.
Parvez actually points out that one of the Quranic words for hell is jahim, and he translates jahim as stagnation.
Right. He compares a healthy, dignified society to a flowing river. He calls them sabiqan, those who are in motion, constantly moving forward, purifying themselves through action.
But a society that accepts the chains of Mulukiyat, a society that stops thinking critically, that stops fighting for dignity, becomes jahim. It stops flowing.
It becomes a stagnant swamp. The water is technically the same water, but because it has lost its movement, it eventually starts to rot. It breathes disease. It starts to stink.
Stagnation as the ultimate societal hell. When you stop moving forward, when you stop questioning the scheming night and day of the mustakbirin, you become the swamp. You lose your sharaf insaniyat.
And when the flood of consequence finally arrives, when the society inevitably collapses under the sheer weight of its own corruption and inefficiency, the collapse does not discriminate between the master and the slave.
Which brings us full circle, right back to our courtroom in the ashes of the ruined civilization, the synthesis of the argument.
The final verdict on this bitter dispute between the arrogant elite and the masses who followed them.
Who is ultimately guilty for the destruction of the society?
The devastating answer is that both are guilty. The failure of the society is a collective failure, even if the power within that society was vastly unequal.
This is the crucial, inescapable takeaway from Parwez's analysis. The divine law of consequence, the mukafat amal, does not accept the excuses of either party. Both the manipulators who built the machine and the manipulated who turned the gears must answer.
You know, during the courtroom argument, the masses actually petition for a heavier penalty for the elites, don't they?
They do. They say they led us astray, they ran the psychological operations, so punish them twice as hard.
And the response they receive in the text is a chilling equalizer. The text states that both groups will receive a double punishment.
Wow, both groups.
Both. The elites, the mustakbirin, receive a double punishment for straying from the rational path and for actively utilizing their resources to lead others astray.
Okay, that makes sense. But why the masses?
Because by surrendering their rational intellect, by willingly accepting the chains of tradition, and by bowing to human masters, they provided the elites with the very fuel required to oppress them.
I see.
The elites possessed no inherent magical power. Their power was built entirely, brick by brick, upon the foundation of the masses' complicity. Without the willing slave, the master ceases to exist.
That is an incredibly bitter pill to swallow for anyone who views themselves as a victim of a system.
Yeah.
What Parwez is effectively doing with this analysis is dismantling the two great cowardly excuses of human history.
Yes.
This three-verse courtroom scene entirely destroys the excuse of the weak, the excuse that says we were only following orders. We saw this exact defense deployed at the Nuremberg trials.
Oh, absolutely.
The engineers, the soldiers, the bureaucrats of the fascist regime sat in the courtroom and said, we were just small cogs. The leaders made the decisions. But international law, much like the Mukafat Iamal Parwez describes, rejected that defense.
The law says you possessed agency. You possessed an intellect, you knew right from wrong, and you chose to switch your conscience off for the sake of survival or career advancement. You cannot abdicate your human responsibility.
And the text equally destroys the excuse of the elite. The excuse that says, we were only giving orders, they chose to follow them, we just opened the casino.
The law of consequence says no. You schemed night and day. You manipulated the flow of information. You obscured the truth with cheap popularity. You weaponized religious dogma. You intentionally designed a system to strip human dignity from the vulnerable.
Both historical excuses are emphatically rejected. The law of cause and effect reaches everyone in the chain of complicity. There is no escape hatch for anyone who participated.
It is a terrifyingly rational view of justice. There is no magic wand that waves away your complicity just because you weren't the one sitting on the throne wearing the crown.
If you held up the throne, if you paid the taxes without question, if you chanted the morning mantras to ignore the suffering outside your window, you're an active participant in the collapse.
Parwez notes a grim detail at the end of his lecture, actually. He says that those whose humanity is completely dead, those who have totally surrendered their intellect, they don't even feel the fire of the collapse.
Really?
Yeah, the text describes them as stones that fuel the fire. But for those who still possess a tiny spark of conscience, who suddenly wake up in this collapsed courtroom and realize the magnitude of what they have done.
The realization that they built their own hell.
Exactly, that they forged their own chains. It's an agony from which they constantly try to escape, but mathematically cannot.
Let's consider the implications of this for the present moment. We started this deep dive by looking at an autopsy of a failed society from an ancient text, filtered through the lens of a lecture from 1980.
Right.
But the mechanics of power, the architecture of manipulation, and the human capacity for complicity haven't changed one bit. The only difference is the technology.
The algorithms are vastly faster than the propagandists of the past. The cheap popularity is hyper-targeted to your specific neurochemistry. The scheming night and day is literally in your pocket, vibrating for your attention.
The fundamental question Parwez forces us to ask remains exactly the same. Are you fiercely protecting your sharaf insaniyat, your rational intellect, and your dignity?
Or are you slowly, quietly handing it over to a master, whether that master is a politician, a corporation, an algorithm, or a dogma, in exchange for convenience, entertainment, or an illusion of safety?
We leave you with this final provocative thought to mull over as you navigate the systems around you. If the hell of a failed society isn't a fiery pit waiting for you in the afterlife, but just a cold, stagnant space that remains empty until we bring our own embers to it.
What daily, silent compromises are you making right now?
What small surrenders of your critical thinking, what quiet acceptances of everyday injustices are quietly forging the very chains you'll one day try to blame on someone else?
The courtroom in the ashes is always waiting. And the only viable defense you'll have is the dignity you adamantly refuse to surrender.